Picture the most effective manipulation you have ever witnessed. Maybe it was subtle. A favor offered at exactly the right moment, creating an obligation that was never explicitly named but was always quietly understood. Maybe it was structural, a system so normalized that the people inside it couldn't see it as a system at all. Maybe it was something that looked like generosity from the outside but functioned as a trap from the inside. Something given freely that somehow created a debt. Something that felt like a gift but worked like a chain. Now make that substance the most psychoactive, widely available compound in the ancient world. Make it socially embedded to the point where refusing it marks you as an outsider. Make it physiologically addictive. Make it the currency of hospitality, of ceremony, of political legitimacy, of divine connection. Make it something that every person of status offers and every person of lesser status accepts. That is alcohol. And the story of how it was used, deliberately, systematically, across cultures and centuries and continents, to manage, manipulate, pacify, indebt and control human beings, is one of the most consistently overlooked stories in all of history. Not because the evidence is thin. The evidence is extensive. It is overlooked because it is uncomfortable. Because it sits at the intersection of something we celebrate, the ancient tradition of the shared drink, the communal cup, the toast, and something we prefer not to examine too closely, the machinery of power that was running underneath it the whole time. Let's start at the beginning. Not the very beginning. We covered the origins of alcohol already, but the beginning of alcohol as a tool of social control specifically. And for that, we go to the place where the historical record opens most clearly. We go to Sumer. Mesopotamia, roughly 5,000 years ago, is producing the earliest written records in human history. Clay tablets covered in cuneiform script, pressed by reed styluses into wet clay and then baked hard. And what are some of the very first things written down by the very first literate civilization on Earth? Ration records. Specifically, beer ration records. The workers who built the temples and ziggurats of ancient Sumer, the massive labor forces that moved stone and brick and timber in quantities that required coordination at a scale the world had never previously seen, were paid partly in beer. Not given beer as a treat. Paid in beer as a formal component of their compensation, tracked on clay tablets with the same bureaucratic precision as grain and silver. Different grades of worker received different quantities of different grades of beer. Skilled laborers got more. Unskilled laborers got less. Supervisors got better quality. The entire hierarchy of the labor force was encoded in the beer ration, made legible and reinforced every single day through the simple act of drinking. This is not incidental. This is architecture. The beer ration is doing several things simultaneously that serve the interests of the institution administering it. It creates dependency. If a portion of your caloric intake comes from the ration, you need the ration to continue. It creates daily physical presence. You have to show up to collect it, which means the institution knows where you are and that you are working. It creates social hierarchy in a form that is experienced as hospitality rather than as domination. Because being given a drink by someone is culturally coded as generosity across virtually every human society. And it creates a mild, daily, physiological adjustment to alcohol that over time becomes part of the body's expected baseline. Not addiction in the clinical modern sense, but a physical relationship with the substance that makes its absence noticeable. The workers building the pyramids of Egypt were operating under a nearly identical system. We know this not from speculation, but from the administrative records left by the pyramid builders themselves, discovered in the 1980s at a site called Wadi al-Jaf. The rations for the labor gangs that built the Great Pyramid of Giza included bread, meat, and beer. The beer was not supplemental, it was central. It was caloric fuel in a context of extreme physical exertion. But it was also social management. The gangs were organized into teams with names: the Friends of Khufu, the drunkards of Menkaure, names that created group identity and competitive loyalty among men who were working themselves to the edge of their physical limits. The beer ration was the daily reward that made the identity real. You worked with your gang. You drank with your gang. The drink and the work became inseparable. This pattern, labor, beer, loyalty, hierarchy expressed as differential ration, repeats across ancient civilizations with a consistency that should give us pause. It is not coincidence, it is a discovered technology. Different administrators in different places and different centuries kept arriving at the same insight. If you control the alcohol supply and position yourself as its distributor, you control the social dynamics of the group receiving it. The power flows from the cup outward. Now let's talk about the elite drinking ceremony, because this is where alcohol as control gets considerably more sophisticated. Across ancient cultures, Greece, Rome, China, Mesoamerica, the Celtic world, the Norse world, the courts of ancient Persia, there is a recurring institution that looks like a party but functions as a political technology. A gathering of people with status or people aspiring to status convened around shared drinking. The Greek symposium, the Roman convivium, the Germanic mead hall, the Chinese banquet. The details differ. The structure is identical. The host provides the drink. The drink is abundant. The drink is good, better than what most people can access privately. And the act of drinking together in the host's space from the host's supply creates a web of obligations, loyalties, and social debts that persist long after the evening ends. You don't just drink at a symposium, you perform your relationship with the host. You signal your place in the hierarchy, you audition for favor, you demonstrate your worthiness to be included in the room that matters, and the host, presiding over all of it, controlling who is invited and who is not, what is served and in what quantity and in what order, is running a political operation with alcohol as the medium of exchange. Aristotle wrote about the symposium as a site of political formation. The Roman convivium was where careers were made and broken, where alliances were sealed, and where the guest who drank too much and said the wrong thing in front of the wrong people found himself no longer invited to the rooms where decisions were made. The mead hall of the Germanic and Norse world was the physical locus of the warrior's bond to his lord. You ate and drank at your lord's table, you fought and, if necessary, died for your lord in the field, and the two things were not separate transactions. The drinking was the contract, the mead was the seal. The Chinese banquet takes this to perhaps its most elaborately codified form. The protocols around who sits where, who toasts whom, who drinks first, who refills whose cup. These are not social niceties. They are political statements made in the presence of witnesses that establish and confirm hierarchical relationships with a precision that formal language sometimes cannot match. To refuse a toast in the wrong context is an insult. To offer one is an obligation. To be toasted by someone of significantly higher status is both an honor and a trap, because now you owe them something that has no explicit price tag, but that they will collect at a time of their choosing. The cup passes and the debt passes with it. This is alcohol as soft power, as the medium through which hierarchy is made visible, through which loyalty is performed and tested, through which inclusion and exclusion are managed, without ever having to name what is actually happening. But soft power has a harder edge, and that edge appears when we look at what happened when alcohol encountered populations that had no prior relationship with it. This is the piece of the story that goes from uncomfortable to genuinely dark. The physiological impact of alcohol on populations with little prior exposure is not uniform. The development of alcohol metabolizing enzymes, particularly variants of alcohol dehydrogenase, in human populations tracks closely with the historical presence of alcohol in those populations' diets. Populations with long histories of alcohol consumption going back thousands of years have generally had more time to develop enzymatic variants that process ethanol efficiently. Populations without that history, populations whose ancestors lived in environments where fermented beverages were not part of the food system, have, in many cases, significantly different physiological responses to alcohol. Not universally, not as a simple rule, but as a population-level tendency that has been documented across multiple studies, and that has real-world consequences when those populations are suddenly exposed to concentrated alcohol for the first time. Indigenous peoples of the Americas had fermented beverages, chicha, pulque, various fruit and grain fermentations, but did not, in most cases, have distilled spirits. Distilled alcohol is a qualitatively different substance from fermented alcohol. The fermentation process naturally caps alcohol content at roughly 15% before the yeast dies in its own waste. Distillation can push that to 40, 50, 60, 70%. It is a different compound in terms of its physiological impact, and no amount of prior exposure to fermented beverages fully prepares a body or a culture for it. When European colonial powers introduced distilled spirits to indigenous populations across the Americas, the Pacific, Africa, and elsewhere, they introduced a substance that these populations had no cultural, social, or physiological framework for managing. The ceremonial and social structures that had, in many cases, kept alcohol use controlled in European contexts, the norms around when you drank, how much, in what context, with what ritual framing, did not transfer. The substance transferred, the management system did not. And in many cases, the colonial powers knew exactly what they were doing. The fur trade of North America is one of the most thoroughly documented examples. Alcohol, brandy, rum, whiskey was used deliberately and systematically by European traders as a trade good, specifically because of the leverage it created. A trapper who had developed a dependency on alcohol could be induced to trade furs at rates that a sober negotiation would never have produced. The dependency created urgency. The urgency destroyed the ability to hold out for a fair price. The trader with the alcohol supply had structural power over the trader without it, and that power was exploited with a thoroughness that the historical record documents in painful detail. Company records, trader journals, colonial administrative correspondence. All of it contains references to alcohol as a trade tool, to the deliberate cultivation of dependency, to the understanding, stated explicitly in some documents, that the alcohol supply was a mechanism of commercial and social control. This was not limited to North America. The British East India Company used opium rather than alcohol as its primary dependency-creating trade commodity in China. A different substance, the same logic. The Portuguese in West Africa, the Dutch in Southeast Asia, the French in the Pacific. Different empires, different substances, different populations, identical underlying strategy. Introduce a psychoactive substance that creates physical or psychological dependency, position yourself as the supplier, and leverage the dependency into political and economic compliance. The mechanism works for the same reason the Sumerian beer ration worked, scaled up to a colonial dimension and stripped of whatever pretense of mutual benefit the ration system maintained. You control the supply of something the body has learned to need. That control is power. That power can be converted into labor, into land, into political submission, into the dismantling of the social structures that might otherwise organize resistance. It is one of the larger moral atrocities in the history of commerce. It is also one of the most consistently underemphasized. Let's come back to the ancient world for a moment, because there is a dimension of alcohol as control that operates not through dependency or labor management, but through something more subtle. Something that works on the mind rather than the body. Alcohol lowers inhibition. This is pharmacology, not metaphor. It suppresses activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, risk assessment, long-term planning, and the evaluation of social consequences. A person who has been drinking is measurably less able to accurately assess risk, more likely to agree to things they would otherwise decline, more susceptible to social pressure, more likely to make commitments they would not make. sober. This is not a character flaw. It is a predictable neurological response to a specific chemical compound. And it was understood, empirically, by people who had no neuroscience. It was understood the way most ancient knowledge was understood, through pattern recognition, through observation, through the accumulated wisdom of people who had watched what happened when alcohol was introduced into negotiation, into diplomacy, into situations where agreement was desired. Ancient diplomatic practice across multiple cultures shows evidence of deliberate use of alcohol in negotiation. The Persian court, documented by Greek historians who were sometimes horrified and sometimes admiring, had a practice of making major decisions twice. Once sober and once drunk, and only proceeding with a decision if it survived both conditions. Which sounds like wisdom and is in one reading. But it also tells you that the Persians understood that alcohol changed what people agreed to. The double deliberation rule exists because someone noticed that drunk agreements and sober agreements diverged, and that both had to be checked against each other. Roman sources describe the deliberate use of wine in diplomatic contexts, banquets where the objective was to create an atmosphere of warmth and goodwill, where the wine served that purpose, and where decisions made in that atmosphere were legally and politically binding, even if the parties were not entirely sober when they made them. The Greek historian Thucydides describes negotiations where the wine flowed strategically, where the host controlled the pace of drinking and the sobriety of the guests while managing their own intake more carefully than appearances suggested. The host who stays sober while the guests drink has an information advantage. They see clearly. The guests do not. They hear exactly what is said. The guests may not remember it clearly the next morning. They can assess the situation accurately. The guests are operating on impaired judgment. This asymmetry is as old as fermented beverages and has been exploited consciously and deliberately for as long as there have been stakes worth exploiting it for. There is also the religious dimension, which is where alcohol as control reaches its most architecturally complete form. In ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and across Mesoamerica, alcohol was not just a social lubricant or a labor management tool, it was a divine substance, a gift from the gods. Ninkasi in Sumer, Osiris in Egypt, Dionysus in Greece, Mayahuel in Aztec tradition. The goddess or god of fermentation and intoxication was not a minor deity attached to a peripheral cultural practice. They were central figures in the religious cosmology, connected to fertility, to the cycle of seasons, to the relationship between the human world and the divine. This matters for control because it means that the institution controlling the alcohol supply was not just managing a resource, it was managing the access point to the divine. The temple in ancient Mesopotamia was simultaneously a religious center, an administrative center, a grain storage facility, and a brewery. The beer that came from the temple was not just beer. It was beer that had been produced in proximity to the sacred, that had been offered to the gods before being distributed to humans, that carried the sanction of divine approval. To drink the temple beer was to participate in something holy. To be excluded from it was to be excluded from that participation. The priests who controlled the temple controlled the grain. They controlled the grain supply, the beer production, and the access to the divine all at once. That is not three kinds of power. It is one kind of power expressed through three channels simultaneously. And the people receiving the ration were not just receiving calories and mild intoxication. They were receiving divine favor administered daily by the institution they depended on for their survival. That is a nearly perfect control system. The dependency is physical, social, economic, and spiritual simultaneously. The institution providing the alcohol is employer, landlord, government, and church all at once. And the substance moving through all of those relationships is the same jar of beer, administered with ceremony, received with gratitude, and understood by everyone, giver and receiver alike, as a gift rather than a mechanism. The genius of it, if genius is the right word for something this troubling, is that it mostly was a gift. The beer was real, the calories were real, the warmth and the social connection and the mild daily pleasure were real. The control was also real. These things are not mutually exclusive. A gift can be genuine and still create dependency. A relationship can be warm and still be asymmetric. A ceremony can be meaningful and still serve the interests of the people administering it more than the people receiving it. This is the most sophisticated version of the mechanism and the hardest to see clearly from inside it. The Sumerian worker who received their daily beer ration was genuinely being fed. The guest at the Roman convivium was genuinely enjoying themselves. The indigenous trapper exchanging furs for rum was genuinely getting something they wanted. The fact that these transactions also created dependency, obligation, and structural vulnerability, that the giver was always more in control than the receiver, that the supply could be cut off as punishment or withheld as leverage, does not cancel the genuine pleasure. It operates alongside it, quietly in the background, running the actual machinery while everyone focuses on the drink in their hand. So what does all of this add up to? It adds up to this. Alcohol has been a tool of social control for as long as there have been social hierarchies to maintain. Not always consciously, not always cynically. Sometimes with genuine care for the people being managed, sometimes with naked exploitation, and most often with something in between. A mixture of genuine generosity and structural self-interest that the people in power were probably no better at clearly seeing than the people receiving it. The beer ration and the colonial rum trade and the diplomatic banquet and the temple brewery are not separate stories. They are the same story at different scales, in different eras, with different degrees of violence and visibility. The mechanism is the same, the substance is the same, the asymmetry is the same. The person controlling the cup controls the room, has always controlled the room. Will continue to control the room as long as there are cups and rooms and people inside them who want to drink. Next time someone offers you a drink, accept it. It's probably fine, but maybe notice just for a second who's pouring.